Right now, NATO is preoccupied by the threat from Russia in the air, with drones closing down our airports and MiGs overflying our borders last month. But what if it's not the air above us that we should be really worrying about the most, but what's happening in our seas below us? In today's digital world, our undersea cables are the backbone of modern life, and that's why Western intelligence agencies assess Russia has drawn up detailed plans to hit us where it could really hurt us by sabotaging those cables. And that sabotage may have already begun. So how serious is this new threat? And are we doing enough to protect our undersea cables here in Britain? The threat is very serious, some very senior voices are now saying, and no, we are not doing enough to combat it, not at all. Welcome to The General and the Journalist, this week with me, Tom. My general on the half, Patrick, is on his travels in a fascinating part of the world that he's promised to tell me all about next week. So in his place, I'm joined instead by another big former player in defence, the former Labour Defence Secretary under Gordon Brown, John Hutton, now Lord Hutton. Amongst many other things he does, John is a member of the Joint Committee on National Security Strategy. It's one of Parliament's most senior committees, and it's packed full of former Cabinet Ministers and a former Cabinet Secretary too. Last month, the committee released a report on undersea cables. It was little notice at the time, released while President Trump was here on his second state visit, but it made for some very sober reading. And as John told me, that's not all they did. In private, the committee felt the need to take an even more dramatic step. Here's our conversation. John, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
It's good to see you again. Mm-hmm. Since stepping down as Defence Secretary, you've maintained really strong links to defence. You've chaired RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, the great think tank. You obviously now sit on the National Security Strategy Committee. Fair to say, defence really has stuck under your skin.
It has, and it didn't just start when I became Secretary of Defence. I've had a long interest in military matters, and the people who serve the country in uniform, they're really special people, and I've always felt that connection with them, even though I myself have never served. But I get the values of the armed forces, and it's the finest example in my mind of public service. So maximum respect for anyone who joins up and serves.
Well, we've got that much in common as well. Maximum respect, no service on my side either. When we used to talk in the late noughties, 2008, 2009, when you were Defence Secretary, it was all about Afghanistan and Iraq, wasn't it? I'm curious, when you had the job, when you were Defence Secretary, how much of your time was taken up worrying about and talking about undersea cables?
None. No, I didn't.
Zero?
No, we never looked at this. We never talked about it. Yeah. The principal threat assessment then was that Britain faced a period of asymmetric warfare, what the military guys we refer to as terrorism. And that was going to be the norm, really looking out as far ahead as we could see. There was obviously still the prospect of, proper conventional warfare with a equally armed opponent like Russia. But that was really quite a long way over the horizon. I mean, the geopolitical landscape in the noughties was very different. We were trying to make friends with Russia, and to some extent we were succeeding. And, we were right to do that. I mean, really, in an ideal world, we should be able to make common cause with Russia. Part of the European family, share a similar range of interests and concerns, of course. It's always eluded us, though, that sort of strategic friendship with Russia. We've never been able to cross that barrier. It's a great shame. But no, 20 years ago, I think the prospect of what we're looking at now, people would have laughed you out of court.
They would have. Let's just begin by explaining exactly what undersea cables do to those who might not know. And I must admit, I had to do a fair bit of Googling last night, precisely what they do. In your words, data and electricity. Does that sum it up?
It's our connection to the digital world. It's the internet and everything that goes with it. And I think people, just you step back for a second, can we imagine life now without access to that information stream? And the truth is we can't. We wouldn't be able to. From the simple sort of day-to-day stuff about managing your household, your food, your utilities, but crucially to your finances. And I think the biggest concern that we had when we looked at our vulnerabilities, one of the biggest concerns, is the financial services sector. Just imagine a country where you can't access your bank account.
And
you can't pay your bills. You can't get anything done. That's a world of utter chaos where civil order is going to hang by a thread if we don't manage that properly.
And that's because all the data that the banks use and trade in and
Sure.
money flows, etc., so much of that
Sure.
goes under the sea to America, to Europe, etc.
Tom,
on a
it all
second-by-second
goes
basis.
under the sea.
Yeah.
That's where all of it goes.
Yeah.
So it is really perhaps the most important part of our national infrastructure. We tend to think of infrastructure as sort of power stations and sort of big projects we can see. We can't see the undersea cables, but without them, we are going to be propelled back almost into the sort of dark ages. So they're vital to modern life, absolutely the crucial thing that hangs everything together.
How much of the internet depends on undersea cables? Because you'd think that these vast companies, the Google, etc., yes, we know they're headquartered in California, that's where all their main servers are, but you'd think they'd have backup servers in the UK just in case something goes down like an undersea cable.
Well, there is that capability, but the undersea cables feed the whole system. It is impossible to imagine how we would cope, for example, if all of the main undersea cables were fractured.
So the number of cables coming into the UK, it's around 60, 65, isn't it? And they're fibre optics, they're about 2-3 centimetres thick, and they're then protected and carefully in rubber, steel, etc. So they're very, very sort of durable, certainly to sea conditions, so that's why they were built. And there are around 450 cable networks worldwide, which is something like 1.4 million kilometres in cable alone. It's huge.
Well, we are a connected world now, and the connections that allow us to function in the way that we do and we've become used to are all provided through these cables.
I was looking at a map where all our cables come in. It's fascinating. It's not the great metropolises you might think. So Bude in Cornwall, most people would associate with Bucket and Spades holidays, is the epicentre for all the transatlantic cables and cables to Africa. On the east coast, Southwold is where the main terminal comes into mainland Europe. And then Southport on the northwest is where a lot of cables go to Ireland. It's fascinating how lesser-known places get put on the map by this.
Well, there's a historical sort of connection, obviously. When they first laid the telegraphic cables across the Atlantic, they all landed in Cornwall. Obviously, they would, because that's the furthest part of the country that sticks out into the Atlantic. And the same is true with the undersea cables. The landing stations are fixed, obviously, at the most convenient point where the cable comes ashore from wherever it's originated from. You mentioned Europe. You talked about North America and so on.
Now, the cables sit anything between a few feet underwater when they go into the oceans, obviously, right down to 8,000 metres deep. So they're very deep in some places, but they alternate. You've said they're the most important thing for us today, our most important bit of infrastructure for civilian use, and I think that's understandable. But they have military purpose as well, don't they?
Well, the military is part of the digital world now, and it has been for 20 years. I mean, we talk about networked sort of military operations and so on. Army, Navy, and the Air Force obviously rely absolutely on digital transmission of information. So they have their own system of information management and logistics, as you would imagine. But I think the whole framework of undersea cables, its role in supporting the digital economy, the digital world, is really the reason why we should see it as perhaps the number one bit of our infrastructure that we need to think about when we think about potential things going wrong or the country being under attack. To succeed in disabling the ability of the UK to defend itself, you'd look at the digital network first.
So let's talk about the threat then, because for years and years, ever since Cyrus W. Field and the Nato carrier were putting down their cables, for years it was just accidental damage. It was either bad weather conditions or fishing boats, big boats, dropping their anchors down by mistake. And there was accidental damage, which is why sometimes these cables got damaged and they had to be repaired. But the more recent threat, really in the last 10 or so years, is sabotage. And the biggest player in that is Russia, isn't it?
That's what all the evidence would point to, yes. And when the government published its national security strategy recently, I mean, I think they were putting us all on notice that the game has changed and the level of threat has risen quite significantly. And the prudent thing to do right now, because we have got some time, is to make sure that we've got proper protections wrapped around these core parts of our infrastructure, without which we can't successfully defend ourselves. But yeah, I mean, it's not just the cables, of course, we've got to think about. It's where the cables come on shore. So, the whole infrastructure of the cables has to be on the radar of government in understanding what they need to do to keep those connections secure.
So Russia's deviance with all this, they do it in several different ways. They map out, first of all, where our cables are. They do that very visibly. They put great big ships, sort of obviously spy ships over it. The Yantar being a good example, that's created quite a bit of controversy. Whacking great Russian ship that looks like a research ship, but in fact it's packed full of sensors, etc. That blatantly hovers over where our cables are, openly telling us, we're here, look what we're about to do. Why do you think they do that? It's very much part of Russia's hybrid grey zone warfare playbook, isn't it? But what are they up to?
Well, I don't know for sure, Tom, what they're up to. I mean, they're risking, obviously things escalating by some of the behaviors they've demonstrated. I think they are, as you rightly said, just keen to understand where everything is. And for obvious reasons, should we find ourselves at a time of heightened tension, they want to know exactly where our weak spots are. Of course they are. Just as we do the same for them. But I think it is a dangerous time right now, and it wouldn't take much, to trip over from a sort of intel gathering mission into something that was seriously provocative. And I obviously think we need to try and manage that as best we can. We don't want to find ourselves in that situation. But it's quite clear to anyone who's looking that they are trying to gather this vital information and understand our vulnerabilities, and we've got to guard against that.
And they've actually moved from research and espionage spying to actual operations of haven't they? Or certainly that is what we all suspect. The most notorious one being in December last year between Finland and Estonia, a great big Russian-linked oil tanker, the Eagle S, which is very much suspected to be part of Russia's shadow fleet, moving all around the world illegally, just happened to drop his anchor and rip up a pretty important power cable, taking power from Finland to Estonia, knocking out quite a significant amount of power to Estonia pretty much over Christmas. And the crew was arrested and taken in for questioning, etc., and they were boarded. But that was quite clearly a disruption operation, and no one was any doubt of that, were they?
Well, I've got no doubt at all about that. It was quite obviously a provocation and a deliberate move by Russia to show us what they can do and what they're capable of. I think the undersea cables are slightly different, though, Tom. There are many more of them.
This is, of course, a power cable rather than
Yes, power cable rather than the sort of cables we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a lot of cables going across the Atlantic, and I think that's been part of the fail-safe way of operating. If there's a problem with one cable, there are others that you can reroute the information through and so on. And that's a good strategy to have because it makes it harder for your opponents to really get at the capability that they want to.
But it's also the Chinese, isn't it? So there was an incident in November 2024. The Yipeng 3 ship, which is a Chinese cargo ship, allegedly severed 2 subsea cables connecting Germany and Finland and then Lithuania and Sweden. Do you suspect the Chinese of being behind precisely sort of disruptive operations that the Russians are out to?
Well, again, I don't know for sure. I mean, I think in that case, I'm perhaps more willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the Chinese. I think you've always got to ask yourself, why would they do that? What would be the strategic purpose behind it? And I struggle to see why the Chinese would be interested in an operation like that in Northern Europe.
Just to tell us they're there, they can.
Yeah, but I accept that's possible, but I would have thought there are probably easier places for them to demonstrate that than Northern Europe, particularly, with the dispute looming with Taiwan and so on. But, you don't know. But, you've got to assume that the rules of the game have changed, and I certainly do, and I think the Select Committee does. And that means we need to move into a different level of strategy and policy about protecting this infrastructure.
Out of interest, I don't know if you necessarily know this, how many cables would a nefarious player have to sever to do us real damage? There are lots. We know there are 6 or so coming to the UK. Would you have to cut the lot or just a few?
It is possible to reroute data. There's capacity to do that. I think, if there was a significant disruption to a large number of those cables, we'd all know it pretty straight away. What would tip us over the edge into a really apocalyptic environment is hard to be absolutely clear about. But I think you need most of those cables to be disrupted before that were to happen. So there is no prospect of rerouting data through other sources.
Yeah. I mean, what was one of the really interesting things that jumped out in your report was you put precisely this question to the telecoms minister who came before you, Chris Bryant, former colleague of yours. He didn't seem to know either how many cables our nefarious actors could sever for us to stay, above the surface, so to speak. And he called it a moot point.
Well, I don't blame him for the answer that he gave. I think that was probably the truthful answer, actually. I don't think anyone could be 100% sure. Remember, it would be a hugely complex operation for anyone to take out all of the undersea cables. I mean, that is quite something.
It involves submersibles, submarines working out of ships, anchor dragging,
Indeed.
Explosives. It's a big operation.
It's a huge operation. But remember, the other side of this equation, we talked about the landing, where these cables land. That's a key point of vulnerability too. If you wanted to really disrupt communications, you've got sabotage, operations in mind as well on land, which could be significant. And one of the things we do say in the report is that we really need to think about the security, the physical security of the places where these cables land in the UK, because there's not much security there at the moment.
Bit of a barbed wire fence, the odd security guard. Not even that.
Yeah, it varies a bit, but there's not much.
You're already getting uncomfortable even discussing it. You're so worried that saying how little is there might help.
But no, I think it's okay to say this because it's important that we understand where we are. We're starting, I would say, Tom, really from sort of ground zero here in building up a proper security strategy for protecting this really vital part of our infrastructure. And the focus in the report a lot was on the cables themselves and the undersea cables. But we did talk quite a lot about the physical security necessary on land to make sure we've got wraparound protection.
Why do you say we're coming from ground zero?
Well, because there isn't much security.
But why not? I mean, if this is such a vulnerability and such a crucial part of our economy.
Yes, but I think when you think about sort of planning for, civil defense, if you like, you always start from the prospect, the situation of, well, what is the threat we face?
Sure.
And I think if you go back 20 years, I think people thought there wasn't a threat.
So let's move on to what we're doing about it now, because that's what your report is absolutely sort of fascinating about, and crucially whether we're doing enough. So we should first of all say that the government, they do have mechanisms in place. They do have surveillance, monitoring networks, etc. The Royal Navy have got surveillance equipment. They've got a big boat, the RFA Proteus, which exists to do precisely that, to monitor what's going on under the seas. There's only one of them, has to be said, although it's quite a beautiful ship. Some rules of engagement were changed recently to allow warships to get closer to suspect vessels. And then there's the ongoing Nato maritime operations, Baltic Sentry in the Baltic and Nordic Warden, because that's obviously a real area of focus as we were discussing. And also, there is a repair capacity at the moment, isn't there? So if something goes wrong with the cables, we can repair them. But I was quite interested to read how few repair ships there really are, and how quickly it takes for them to get there.
Well, we looked at this in the report, and one of our main recommendations was that the UK should have its own sovereign cable repair capacity and capability. We should have a boat really that's just focused really on this particular thing, and is available really at the drop of a hat to get out there and do the work. And we don't have that at the moment.
So there are 6 repair ships. They're all commercially owned.
Yes.
And this is all in your report. If they get the phone call to go and repair something, they'll leave port within 24 hours. Not immediately. Takes them a day to leave the port. So depending where the damage is done, they're traveling around 12 knots. That's the running pace, really. And if it's in the Irish Sea, it might take them between 2 and 7 days to get there and repair, depending on the sea conditions. But it's in the North Atlantic, they could be chugging for 10 days or so to get there. And bad sea conditions, the repair could take a month. That's quite a long time, isn't it?
I think that sort of capability is fine if really the only thing you're planning for is accidental damage. If you think that the situation has changed and actually the threat we might face is deliberate sabotage or deliberate damage, you need a different type of capability. And that's really what we talked about in the report. We need something that's dedicated, can respond very quickly, is always on hand, and is a capability that we control ourselves.
This is a ship.
This is the ship, yeah.
Another RFA Proteus or Royal Navy warship.
Well, that's up to the MOD to sort out how they want to do that.
Yeah.
And we weren't prescriptive about that. But I think there's no doubt at all in our minds as a committee that we felt that really what we've got at the moment in terms of repair isn't really good enough.
The argument the government give, and those commercial players as well, their big pushback is the redundancy point. We touched on that a bit earlier. So you don't need to worry your pretty little heads about one cable going down or even two cables going down, because we've got 64 of these, and if there's a problem, we'll just reroute. What do you say to that?
I think that strategy, again, Tom, is fine if really the principal risk that you think you face is accidental damage. If the principal risk is shifting now to a deliberate attempt to disrupt, then clearly I'm afraid that strategy isn't going to pass muster. You need something more substantial. And you've got to assume that it could be multiple cables that are attacked simultaneously. Now, we've never been in that situation before. We've never really, to be honest, Tom, had to think about that as something that we needed to plan for. But it is a really serious issue of national security, this. And I think it's got to get more attention and focus from government than it has so far.
What do you mean by it's a really serious issue? Because we agree it takes a massive operation to cut so many cables that will take out the internet, take out our banking, etc. But it's doable. If a concerted effort was launched by a hostile state that has that capability, and we certainly know Russia does, they could do this. So what is the worst case scenario? What potentially is the worst hypothetical situation if enough of these cables get cut to the UK, to our daily lives?
Well, we could lose a very great deal of things that really matter to us and allow us to live the lives that we do. I'm not just talking now about, watching Netflix or anything like that. Forget, that's not what I'm talking about, although obviously we would lose some of that.
That would go down too. There'd be no streaming.
It's the fundamentals of national life that would be at risk, how our health service operates, how our banking system operates.
Why is the health service at risk?
It's a digital network. It's a digital service. There's lots of things that would be affected in the NHS. It would disrupt every aspect of the lives that we know. And of course, in the lead up to a more serious conflict, this is exactly where, hostile states would be thinking about sort of developing plans and so on. So I think the thing about civil defense planning generally, and I know this is going to make me sound like a sort of doom monger, which I'm actually not, by the way. You've got to assume the worst if you're going to sort of develop a proper plan to protect yourself. And I think there's evidence that the government is beginning to think like that now. I think the national security strategy did mark a very significant step change in recognizing the nature of the threat we face and the reality of it today. But that work has got to reach down now quite quickly into protecting, specific parts of our vital infrastructure to allow us to go on functioning as an economy, as a society, but also in order to properly defend ourselves. Because we started our conversation talking about how the military is now networked. It's a digital fighting force. If it loses that information flow, it becomes significantly less capable, which is what obviously an enemy would look for. So this is frontline defense territory now. This is not some sort of hypothetical interesting area. This really should be tattooed on the forehead of every civil contingency planner today. What about the cables? How secure are the cables? Are we sure we've got everything that we need to do to preserve and protect the cables? And I honestly, I don't think we're quite in that zone yet, but we've got to get in there pretty quickly.
Banking you seem to be most worried about. In terms of the disruption severing cables would cause here, why does the area of banking trouble you so much?
Because it's fundamental to how we live our lives. I mean, if you imagine you can't pay any of your bills, you can't pay your mortgage. You can't access your cash. You can't shop. You can't buy food. You can't fill your car up with petrol.
And that would happen immediately?
Potentially. It could do, yes. Now, that is a world of significant problems. Civil strife, law and order. I mean, that's as close to the most horrible end of the planning thing that we've got to think about. Because then the whole fabric of our lives is beginning to disintegrate. And it could be gone quickly, literally, just like that. And
the banks stop. You can't get your cash out of the walls. Your Apple Pay doesn't work at the supermarket. I mean, you can't feed the kids for tea. Is it that quick? Seriously?
Potentially, yes. It could be. It could be catastrophic. I think the loss of financial services. People in London, we use our cards to travel around. On the underground, we wouldn't be able to do that. travel, everything would be disrupted. And it is by far and away, to be honest, Tom, the thing that would keep me awake at night if I was in government still. The disruptive effect of the loss of the cables on our financial network and our financial system.
Well, I get the feeling it's keeping you awake at the moment.
Yeah, it's
You're talking
beginning to
quite
sound. I
passionate
am
about it.
actually getting quite worried about it now. But no, I mean, all joking apart, it's number one issue for me.
Yeah. What about the argument of retaliation? It's a little bit like the nuclear deterrent, mutually assured destruction. So, yes, we understand your worry about this, and yes, it is a vulnerability. The government might say, but if the Russians do this to us, we'll do that to them, and then the whole world will go dark. So they're not going to try that.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure you want to bet the house on that.
And that's the point, isn't it? You are betting the house and the banks and the NHS.
Yeah, well, no, but I think what I'm saying is that I don't think you could assume that they wouldn't do that because of the risk to themselves. I think that's a quite dangerous assumption to make.
Although it worked with nuclear deterrent for 80
Yeah,
years.
this is different, I think. But, we had mutually assured destruction as a strategy, yes. But we had other contingencies as well to think about. And I actually think when it comes to military deterrence, I think the thing that's clear to me from Ukraine is that actually, just as we're talking about civil defense and the need for multi-layered sort of protection, I would argue when it comes to military strategy now, we need much more credible conventional deterrence. I wouldn't want to rely now purely on a nuclear deterrent. I would want to see us significantly strengthen our conventional capabilities across NATO to present much more of sort of a hard face to the risk of Russian aggression in Europe than we're currently capable of.
Yeah, it's sort of nothing or everything at the moment. You need something in the middle.
You do need something in the middle.
Where does international law currently sit on what we can do if our cables are attacked? So we had a really interesting question from a listener, from Will, who says, what are the terms for engagement for cable cutting? How should NATO forces deal with direct hostile military interference, and what are they allowed to do?
I mean, I don't know what the rules of engagement are really for this. I mean, we tend to think of NATO engagement as someone's firing at us and then we fire back.
Yeah.
If someone isn't firing at us, the MOD would have to answer that question about what the rules. I don't know what they would be. If we were to catch a ship in the physical act of severing cables or disrupting cables, I think there would have to be some intervention to prevent that. Quite what it would be, I don't know. That would have to be a sort of chain of command issue.
Tony Radakin, the former Chief Defence Staff, one who just stepped down, said in a speech a couple of years back that purposeful damage to undersea cables, because they're so important, should be considered an act of war. Do you agree with that?
It's a hostile act, certainly, and I think our forces would be entitled to intervene to prevent that from continuing. But if you're talking about exchange of fire, which you might well be, you're talking about potentially very serious military repercussions. I mean, that is taking it into armed conflict between two states. But
sometimes the other side, knowing that we would consider this a very, very serious incident, is in itself a deterrent.
Well, I think constructive ambiguity is also quite helpful.
Yeah.
I think they'd have to know we wouldn't stand by and just watch them do it. We should let them guess as to what we'd actually do.
There's a really sobering line in your report that really jumped out at me. In the conclusion, the executive summary, it says, we are not confident that the UK could prevent such attacks or recover with an acceptable time period. That's a very polite way of saying possibly there is a real existential threat to our daily way of life out there, and we can't stop it at the moment.
I think, Tom, we should go back to really the beginning of this conversation when you talked about the extraordinary sort of thing that the subsea cables represent, thousands, millions of kilometers of cable. I think it's impossible for any government to say all of that cable infrastructure will be protected round the clock all the time. It's just physically impossible to do that. That no country could guarantee that. So I don't think planning for the worst case scenario, you should be under any illusion that it's going to happen and you probably can't stop it happening. And that's what we were trying to say. I think it's all about what you do should it happen. and how you can minimize the disruption and really repair the damage and stop it happening again. I think that's the only way you can think about the challenge that you face here. If you start from the assumption, we'll stop it happening anywhere, I think you're on a fool's exercise. You won't be able to stop it.
You need thousands of ships.
You need that, and it's an impossibility.
So to your existential threat warnings, on the committee, the government pushed back again here, didn't they? In front of you, giving evidence, the telecoms minister, Chris Bryant, he said that exploring the risks of a coordinated attack on subsea infrastructure was unhelpfully apocalyptic.
Yes, and that really, caught our attention because we had a profound disagreement with that comment. I think subsequently ministers sort of rode back a bit from that. But I think it's a fundamental point about civil contingency and civil defense planning. You've got to assume the worst. It's not a credible plan if you ignore the worst case scenario and just deal with something that you think you can manage. That's not planning for you've got to plan for every eventuality. And that includes the deliberate, concerted attack on your subsea cable infrastructure. So yes, we were quite surprised that he said that. And it featured in our report because we think it undermines the case, generally the good case the government has for the things that it's been doing. It made us concerned that actually the government isn't planning for the worst case scenario, and they've got to. But I think you always have to tread a fairly fine line, don't you, in this area? You don't want to catastrophize. You don't want to over-exaggerate because that doesn't serve any purpose. In fact, that undermines your argument if you do that. But neither, in the same breath, should you hold back from saying it how it is. And so I don't want to exaggerate the threat. I'm just stating how I see it as a reality in reality, which is that if we don't do more to protect our subsea cables, we risk fundamentally weakening our ability to defend ourselves. And I don't want us to do that. I want us to do the maximum that we can to protect that vital infrastructure. And if we're going to do the maximum to protect it, we've got to do quite a lot more than we're currently doing.
I mean, the irony, of course, to that remark by Chris Bryant there is that you didn't catastrophize the report. In fact, there were areas of the report, there are things you found that you were so worried about. You actually took the detail out of the report and you did something else quite interesting with it. You wrote to the Prime Minister privately.
Well, we don't want to advertise, vulnerabilities to our adversaries. There'd be no point in doing that. I think, the Select Committee, other committees who operate in this space have a long tradition of writing confidentially to senior ministers, in this case the Prime Minister, to highlight the real concerns that we have. And I think that's right and proper. It's striking the right balance. I think the report is pretty hard-hitting, but we certainly do not want to make it a sort of advertising brochure for our enemies to go hunting for targets. But I think however we do it, what's important now is that there is a proper response from the government. And we've highlighted, I think, the vulnerabilities pretty starkly for them and given them a very clear sort of way forward on how they can start to put in place better defences, to stop damage being done to the subsea cables. But, time is not on our side. We've got to crack on with this.
Do you think the Prime Minister does get this now? I mean, has he replied to you? Has he reassured you that he really is on this if he might not have been before, former governments might not have been before, he does now really see the threat?
Well, I think, if there was a minister sitting here in front of the microphone, they'd say we do take the threat seriously and we are doing more, and they are doing more. I just don't think they're doing enough yet. We haven't had a formal response from the government to our report yet. We'll get that in the next few weeks. And then we can all take stock and see, whether this report's really moved the dial or not. I hope it has moved the dial. I mean, this is what we're there to do. We're not there to sort of make up trouble and stir up the pot. We're there to actually help the government really get on and do stuff that's important. And there's plenty in that report that they should consider very carefully, I think.
I remembered something when we were preparing for this episode. A great irony. There was once a very senior member of the British government who, as a very young MP, you might know where I'm going with this, in 2017, bright new young MP, he wrote a report for the Politics Exchange on just this, on subsea cables and the threat to them. And he said, a successful attack on the UK undersea cable infrastructure would be an existential threat to our security, yet governments have not given undersea cables enough attention. Do you know who that bright young MP was?
No, I don't. Who was it?
Rishi Sunak.
Fantastic. There we are.
And yet, he was Prime Minister, and you have published a report since he stepped down as Prime Minister And he didn't fix the problems. They're still there.
He certainly didn't fix this problem. And, it is now the responsibility of the present government to do that. So I'm not going to sort of point finger of blame, but it's time we did stuff now.
Can I suggest why he didn't manage to fix all these problems, although he went into government and went into number 10 policy with the best possible intentions, which is the same reason why it may be that all your list of recommendations, and there are a lot of them, from special ships to changing the law to more proactive deterrence to having more oversight and overwatch, all that costs a lot of money, So building new ships, hundreds of millions of pounds, new sensors, it could get into the billions, and it is unaffordable under the current defence budget, as well you know.
Well, I don't think what we're recommending, would sort of come on the spectrum of disproportionate cost. We're not saying that the government needs to go out and build a new ship. They can lease a ship. There's lots of other options they can do. We don't want the government to spend money that doesn't need to be spent. But some additional resource has got to be found for this purpose. I don't know enough about the current defence budget to say whether that means there isn't enough in it to devote some additional spending to this. But that's a challenge for government. We didn't sort of say you've got to spend 500 million or 2 billion. We can't make a judgment about that. And yes, people will say it's all well and good, armchair, commentators, you're saying the government's got to do this, that money's got to be found. Well, actually, the truth is, Tom, the government's got to find the resource to do this properly. And how it does that is up to it to decide whether it's additional resource or they accommodate this within the defence budget. Either way, for me personally, and I think probably for the committee as a whole, we would say this should score very highly in terms of the government's national priorities for civil defence.
Well, the highest, in your view, if this is the greatest.
Well, in my personal view, it is the highest, yes.
John, thank you for your time. You've been very forthright and eloquent, and I'm very grateful to you. And I don't think I disagree with much of what you say. And I can tell you for sure, if Patrick was here when he's back from his travels next week, he would also agree with pretty much every word you said too. Been fascinating talking to you, and good to catch up with you as well.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's it for today. As always, please do send us your questions and thoughts to generalandjournalists@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalists@thetimes.co.uk. We read them all, and they really are extremely helpful. Until next week, Patrick will be back. Goodbye.